This is Spectrum, a production of educational and public affairs programming at 89.7 WCBT FM. Co-moderators for Spectrum from the Political Science Department of Towson State University are Dr. Pete Morani and Chairperson Dr. Eric Belgrad. Now, here's Dr. Morani.
Thank you. Dr. Morani cannot be with us today, and so I will carry on by myself. And my guest, who today is Raoul Middleman, a Baltimore artist and old friend. Greetings, Raoul. Glad to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
I wanted to ask you a few questions about what it is to be an artist in this day and age. And first of all, our listeners might be interested to know how you came to be an artist, a painter.
Well, I always had, I thought, a certain amount of talent. So that kind of, that's something you don't take any personal responsibility for. But it just kind of puts you in positions where you have that certain ability to draw and a certain need to express yourself that way. And but my initial training was I went to Poly and I went into physics at Hopkins. But I found myself being more and more attracted to the arts, and eventually I got into it, but through a long and very variegated route. After finishing Hopkins, I got a degree in philosophy. I went out west and became a cowboy, and because I was always interested in the West, and I thought I'd be a novelist or something like that. And it was probably my artistic temperament that had been put on another track for a while. And then I found somebody that encouraged me to do art, and I started to play with it. And then when I went into the Army, they discovered I had talent, and I became an artist illustrator for the Army. And from there, I was encouraged, and I went to art school when I got out of the Army, and then I got a job at the Maryland Institute, and it's been more or less that sort of thing since.
Do you find, do you feel that there's an inevitability to you being a painter? Is there something that was bound to happen, or are there any forks in the road that you followed that you might have taken that would have led you in other directions? In retrospect,
it's hard to say. I mean, on one level, you're kind of determined by. It's almost a kind of a Catholic idea of fate. The kind of the determinism, and on the other hand, there's a kind of idea of free will. And when you look back on your life, you see a certain inevitability to all the different moves. But when you're going through it, you're full of kind of existential doubt, and it's open-ended, and you have the illusion perhaps that you're a spontaneous agent. But I mean, it's hard to really answer that.
When you decided finally, and obviously it was when you were already quite mature, when you decided to spend your life as a painter. Did you have any models in mind that you wanted to follow, or was this a perfectly inner-directed kind of drive?
Well, I mean, originally I was greatly impressed by the movie called The Horse's Mouth. Yes. With Alec Guinness, and that just fascinated me, the idea of being able to turn your alienation into cash. I mean, that really appealed to me. So, I mean, I think that was in the back of my mind. I still love that movie tremendously. I love that novel by Joyce Carey and things along that line. But as far as the models go in painting, they change as you grow and change, and you change as you grow as an artist. You find different people you like, and you discard people that you once admired, and you pick up new people that become, especially when you're studying, you would just absorb all the different things that are going to be of use to you. It's a kind of a selfish thing. Your admiration tends toward those things which are going to help you progress in your sensibility.
What I'm curious about is to what extent does an artist begin his artistic life as an original, and to what extent is this originality acquired only with a degree of maturity, of self-assurance, as it were?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think originality is a kind of an interesting question. I mean, to try to be original is a little bit like saying, think. Like it kind of puts a certain self-consciousness to it that's almost constipating. But I think that more or less, I try to address myself to the issues of the craft, or things which I don't really concern myself really with originality. If it's going to be original, then I would hope just the innate nature of my quirky disposition would give it that kind of inflection. rather than being kind of a program toward originality in your work. On the other hand, you find certain things which you get very discontented with, certain attitudes which you discard because they frankly become boring to you, or they don't open up issues that are exciting to you, and maybe you find your originality that way. And another way I think originality comes into play is by a kind of ideas which you really don't understand, and you try to make certain adjustments to them, and it's through this misunderstanding that sometimes you come into an original position. Well, I mean, like Chagall, for example, didn't really understand Cubism, I feel, and he was a folk artist, a Russian folk artist, but his application of Cubism gave him a tremendous, through its misuse, became a very original position, and things along that nature.
So that you see a number of happy accidents occurring in art,
right?
Rather than the pre-planned design.
Well, yeah, I think I'm very much interested in those things that you discover, rather than having a priori made up your mind what's the avenue that you're going to take and the kind of work you're going to do. I think the idea, if you know what you're going to do before you do it, then the doing of it becomes superfluous. I think that idea of discovery, maybe it's just a kind of false romantic notion, but the idea of discovery for me is self-discovery and stuff like that in time, and maybe after the work's already made its statement, and through it then, actually is as important as making a plan ahead of time and just seeing if you can carry it out in a kind of methodical way.
Quite besides the content of your paintings, I know that you still very much experiment with techniques and mediums and what have you that you've worked with all your life long, but you have never quite satisfied. You never think that you've quite hit the solution, the perfect solution to the technical problems of paintings. Could you address yourself to the issue of the kind of turmoil and travail you go through in trying to determine how to approach the blank canvas?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess I got these different strategies which I use, and a lot of times it might be just mixing the paint or using a different kind of medium or something like that. It gets me started, or changing my palette to a limited palette, rather than some kind of grandiose Heidegger-inspired idea. It's just an idea that comes out of a kind of a technical consideration that I'm very anxious to try out. Or I made a new black for myself, and I made the oil more, made the paint more oily, which they call, long paint, or I made it short, which is less oil, and I'm just manipulating the thickness of the paint in a different way. Now, in a certain way, I think like Rembrandt, for example, he uses white lead a lot, and I think part of his conceptual, there's certainly a lot of things in his paintings that you could talk about in very literary terms. On the other hand, I think his paintings are about, in a very large degree, about how he handles white lead, what white lead can do. What are the possibilities of this pigment? Likewise, in similar way, I think Rubens, a lot of times, it reveals what like vermilion can do, what red, this particular red, a kind of a crazy, warm, orangey kind of red, what the qualities of this red, what it can do, and the experience of it, almost on a visceral level, on feeling the materiality of the red. In Rembrandt's case, the materiality of the paint, or in Titian's case, what is it like to paint on a rough linen? I mean, he very seldom paints on a panel, whereas Rubens paints on panel all the time. So the idea of a panel is a very smooth, and it makes for very rapid, spontaneous work that you get in Rubens, whereas the canvas would slow down the speed, and the canvas, with all its rough texture, would encourage overlays, many glazes, and things like that, and so that the temporal is a more temporal experience of the immediacy of the image and the impactual strength of the image. With Rubens, the image is more present tense. It's more, it hits you all at once, and the sense of almost a kind of a jazz musician's improvisational skill becomes apparent in the paint. And with the Titian, there's a kind of a slow, quietistic, contemplative aspect to the paint, which is a different. All this comes out of a kind of a preference for materials, different kinds of materials that best reveal one's sensibility, best reveals what one's content is. I mean, it comes through the materials, not divorced. A lot of people nowadays have an idea that materials and idea of technique is somehow a hindrance. I don't feel it's a hindrance. I think it brings out the full body of one's talent.
And so therefore, obviously, also depending on what it is that you're trying to paint, what it is that you're trying to express,
exactly.
it determines very much which materials you're likely to experiment with.
And you discover yourself through materials, and what the materials are going to do. Like if you're making a charcoal drawing, I think a part of that is saying something about charcoal. You're making a statement about charcoal. You make an ink drawing, you're saying something about ink. If you're doing watercolor, then there's also a language there's a language that grows through the materials. The materials has a history of its language.
Does the material dictate, though, the ultimate nature of the work, or is it simply an approach which then later on is enriched by what you conceptualize as you're working on it?
Well, I mean, the ideas actually are conditioned by the materials, but it's never dictated because the materials can never be governed that much, and you're never really that. There's also another aspect with the question you originally answered. I think it also helps illuminate what you just bringing up, is that we really don't know how to paint anymore. I mean, the guild system's gone. I mean, each painting in a way is an investigation on how to paint. And like the materials, like what materials do you use? Do you use an underpainting? Do you paint directly? Do you use a tone ground? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or do you use a white ground? Or how much white do you put in a painting? What kind of whites do you use? There's a density of the paint. How thick should it be? How thin should it be? What kind of mix? All these are issues that you're constantly trying to, in a way, discover. In a sense, you're trying to discover the language. In a certain sense, the language it has to be reinvented. It has to be regenerative in the present tense. And in a certain sense, there's a continuing tradition. But we've kind of lost, in a certain sense. Certain attitudes of modernism have discredited a position to the past, and so we have to kind of redefine that language, and almost starting from scratch because it hasn't been handed. The links have been broken, and that kind of general information was handed down through the guild system.
Those of us who are not initiates of the more extreme parts of modern painting tend to think that that painting is done in the midst of a profound ignorance and almost a militant rejection of the past. Is that a correct judgment, or is this facile?
Well, I don't think. There was a romantic notion, I think, that one had it, and it became a heroic activity in a certain sense to invent everything yourself. In the old days, the images were, if Piero del Francesco did a resurrection, and everybody did a resurrection. Now, if you do a resurrection, nobody else better do it because they're copying you. It's a whole different idea of originality. I think in the Renaissance, for example, the idea of copying something and being original, they were so closely aligned. Even with Shakespeare, for example, like he copied direct lines out of the Holinshed and people like that, so that you can't tell which is original and which isn't. What we have to do now, I think, is the idea of originality. I think, in a certain sense, to compete with the past, to do a head, for example, or a portrait, might be really more egocentric than to try to do something totally new, because you're putting yourself in the same arena as Rembrandt or Rubens or somebody like that. That's really chutzpah. That really, in a certain sense, is more arrogant. To be traditional might be the most arrogant avant-garde position you could possibly have.
You don't find a challenge then of painting flat surfaces any longer in the pop art fashion that just lost one of its principal heroes recently, painting Marilyn Monroe's and Campbell's soup cans and what have you.
Well, there's a kind of a modern space, a very flat, a very thin, a very fragile space. A space, an industrial space. I think that Warhol actually got, in the sense that the intervals between events are always very synchronized at intervals that are equal, and so that tends to flatten the space. And the lack of space is one of the impoverishments of modern times. So it becomes a thing that he was addressing, and it was an issue at a point.
But that's a cultural statement rather than an artistic statement, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's a cultural statement. But I think art can look outside of itself. It can look outside of the formalistic means of its own. Those kind of confinements. Sometimes I think it's an advantage not to be totally entrapped by aesthetic formalism.
But how far can it be carried out?
How far can it becomes a difference between painting and illustration. If it's just illustrating sociological kind of concerns, then it ceases to be painting and it becomes something else, like basket weaving, or it becomes another thing, and it no longer, because it's not joined to the language, or a traditional language, so no longer it has its generic integrity.
Well, initially you were part of the pop art scene, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And is that the reason why, in fact, you left it for a more traditional pursuit of painting? Well,
I think there was something. I think that the pop idea, that flatness that you talked about earlier, was not particularly my own sensibility was not particularly responsive to that. When I did pop art, I more or less made it very volumetric. And there was a heavy expressionistic side to it and a very painterly side of it, which interfered with the kind of pure pop, the vapid kind of iconography of the pop artist, and it got in the way of it in a certain sense. And if I was really going to develop, I think I had to reject that, because my essentially expressionistic kind of tendencies in nature, basic, intrinsic. I mean, no matter what I did, that was always there, and my real instinct for painterliness was not being aided by a kind of pop commitment. However, I gave it up. I went into landscape painting in order to get away from a certain modernist thing, to be entrapped by this kind of modernism. And I thought I had to get to something very basic. I'm almost a kind of Rousseauian kind of retreat into a kind of an ideal nature almost for myself. And just to find myself without being constantly interpreting it in terms of abstract expressionism or pop art or minimalism, whatever was around in the fashionable kind of flip-flops of current culture. And in doing that, I thought I had left pop art behind, or at least the narrative concerns of it. And then little by little, these narrative concerns really kept coming back in my portraiture and then into larger kind of compositional pieces, until now I can see a real similarity to the pop art, although the whole approach is different, more painterly, and I think much more honest, and I think unique, but who's the judge? Nonetheless, I think there's a certain continuity with that and what I originally was doing with pop art.
Let me interrupt briefly to remind our listeners that they're listening to Spectrum, and my guest today is Raoul Middleman. Raoul, how is your current painting reflective of pop art? I myself don't see that.
Well, I mean, it's a difference. I mean, I'm not a direct way, but I think my painting has a different similarity in the sense that I think pop art dealt with a kind of I think any kind of dramatic art, the public art, it's public in the sense that I like the art I like the idea, like I do murals and things like that, where you have a kind of a public language, a language which is legible and very public. So the idea of a public language, which in that language, using that language, it's almost a cover, a mask for a very personal kind of involvement.
When you say public, you don't necessarily mean monumentally public.
No, I mean in the sense that not monumentally public necessarily, but I mean in a certain sense that the language has kind of shared externals in its kind of and deals with like like mythologies or something like that, maybe contemporary mythologies like lox and cream cheese or something like that is a kind of mythology. So in that sense, you're dealing with those kind of language, but then you deal with your own appetite. I was thinking, like in a self-portrait, for example, is a good example. Rembrandt is always putting himself up in different masks. He might be a Turkish this or that, or some kind of covering mask, but he's dealing with something very personal, and then it becomes mythic at the same time. So that this double language, which I think the pop art had, the language which is on the one hand in the public arena, which is much more egotistical in a certain sense than bringing everything into a kind of a personal reference. If you bring everything into a personal reference, it all becomes like kind of lyrical subjectivity. Then it becomes a kind of onanistic kind of delirium. Especially if you're an expressionist. But when the public language, it kind of keeps it all third person, and yet using that language, I mean, it's very theatrical. Using everything, it has a dramatic kind of flair. You're talking about things very personal, very kooky, very that you couldn't get away with. I mean, if to the same, they're much more persuasive. It's a way to convince. It gives it verisimilitude and credibility. And because you're using that language, which is publicly accepted. I mean, Matisse finally moved from a very personal studio language into the big cutouts and big muralized kind of forms. In a certain sense, that was his ambition.
For our listeners who might not know it, one of your truly public pieces is that large mural at the movie house. What is that called again?
Movies at Harbor Park, or
movies at Harbor Park in the Inner Harbor area.
In the United Artists.
Right. And that is a very large mural. I don't remember the
25
dimensions.
feet by 7.5 feet, which is pretty large.
Yeah.
Dealing with all the marketplaces, the old marketplaces in Baltimore and the harbor, down at Marsh Market, and so forth.
Right. You did this when? Last year, was it? Or the
year before.
Year before. Are there other murals of yours that you could point out?
I did some with my classes that I had the Mural Institute in murals at our Pimlico racetrack. I think we did 7 murals there. Each one is 8 feet by 20. Dealing with various aspects of racing, which I think, it's collaborative effort on the students and myself who did those murals.
Now, muralism is a favorite form, but it's certainly not exclusively what you do. You do a great number of other things. Can you give our listeners an idea of what you have recently been working on?
Well, recently I've been working on, I do a large allegorical and narrative kind of paintings. And I've done a few of those recently during the winter. It's a good time because during the summer I usually do landscapes. It's like going fishing or something like that. I like to get out and, visit the various streams around Baltimore, like the Gunpowder and things like that. So I enjoy that. But during the winter, when you're kind of holed up, I like to do portraits and narratives or allegories, whatever the word would be. And the most recent one I did is called The Fisherman's Wife, which is a story of Grimm's fairy tale, in which features Eric Belgrad as the fisherman sitting on a rock
and talking
to a fish. And the wife has, it might be a kind of a woman lib kind of drama, because the wife has she has these different wishes where she wants to get a better house, and that's not enough, and then she wants to be the Pope, and then she wants to be God, at which point the fish returns her to her original penurious condition. But she leaps in the painting from knitting, from sewing, into a kind of a superwoman, So it's like a kind of a libist kind of fantasy, in which she's experiencing a power on the other side of the bourne of her limitations. So it was a kind of a fun painting, and the whole painting is being told to the audience. I mean, my youngest son is gesturing as if he's telling the story, but he's giving the blessing as if a blessing like the Pope would give. So that kind of brings part of the story into it, and also his hand gestures seem to make a kind of a sign language, which seem to predicate like that the story really takes place on the other side of silence. In other words, that the aesthetic kind of considerations, the formalist things I addressed before, I'm trying to get on the other side of that. I mean, actually, what I'm really interested in is something on the other side of, purely aesthetic considerations. On the other side of, has another dimension in which the gesturing of that painting seems to talk. So I was very pleased with that painting, the way it came out, and the different issues that it addressed.
Clearly, these narratives are very close to your heart. It seems to me that they combine essentially all of the things that you do in painting. Certainly
landscape.
There's landscape, there's portrait painting.
Right.
And then there's a superimposition of this tale, this moral, if you like.
Right.
Which is then expressed symbolically.
Right.
Do you find that modern viewers have an eye and a perception for these tales, or do you not particularly care whether they do or not?
I wouldn't say I don't particularly care. I mean, if I could, for myself, I mean, like when the audience for me is the Tom, Dick, and Harry that are inside my head. I really can't control the audience. I mean, and if they saw something different, that would be great too. I mean, what I'm saying is what I see, and that's informative to me. I mean, one of the most tremendous excitements that my paintings have provided for me is the realization of attitudes that I hadn't suspected existed before I made the painting. And it's almost as if you're a medium or some kind of antenna that picks up and receives some information and transmits it. And then you might become aware of that much later than the actual. It's not something that you had to plan beforehand and then carried it out. It's almost like having an original gesture in abstract expressionism. And from that original gesture, you make the whole painting. Or as Lipschitz said one time, that he put his hands into hot wax or clay or something, hot wax, and then plunge it into the water to give an initial gesture. A lot of times I start a painting, I don't know where it's going to go. And I'll let the painting kind of tell me where it's going to go, and that's very exciting to me. As Pascal once said, that the last thing one knows about a book is its title when you're writing it. I mean, it's like that journey from innocence to knowledge becomes for me personally. And so the audience is really inside myself, and when I discover these things, it's for my own enlightenment. I would hope that it would reach out further than that, but that's as far as I'm able to have any kind of real handle on it.
Do you find that most artists, in fact, are that unconscious of their viewership, either in the present or in the future, or do they have a secret eye out on what history is going to have to say about their work?
It depends on how inveterate their careerism is, but I mean, a lot of people might have a secret eye out for what would go, and fashionable, which would be fashionable, or which would be, would have its effect. I mean, they have their antenna out. I think there's a little probability that goes on with anybody, because that's our weakness, I mean, there's no such thing as pure integrity, and you want to succeed, and part of it is that. But on the other hand, each fashionable kind of position is momentary, and I think if the ambition is strong and vast. I mean, if the ego is big and soaring, you're going to look beyond that and maybe even, I mean, maybe the most difficult thing is to do something when you're out of fashion and to be able to maintain yourself in that when you don't have the accolades and the pats on the back or the encouragement. And the guys I admire most really went into tremendous self-doubt and isolationism, and they can't. Some of them come out of that. It's very difficult, and when they come out of that, there's nothing more marvelous than what they have accomplished, like Cézanne, like Rembrandt, like through Daphnis Goya and Beethoven. It's just a tremendous isolation and being out of favor almost that pushed them beyond the necessary fashionable formulas for success into something else. And incredible heroism. I have tremendous respect for these people because it's a day-by-day thing over a year. It's not something you just conceptualize and you say that's great. I mean, it's something you have to live over many years and to endure the pain of it, and they did.
Well, obviously, the worst thing that happens to an artist if he never gets any commission or he never gets any sale. That's the kind of heroism, I suppose, that you point to. But there's another side to this. When a work is commissioned, to what extent can the artist maintain control over what happens? To what extent does a commission dictate what gets done?
Well, the commissions, a lot of times, even the Renaissance, dictate a lot what got done and the attitudes and the way the gestures are going to be and what the donor, you have to put the donor into the thing and all that. And sometimes
does that in any way strike at the integrity of the piece of work?
Well, sometimes it strikes at integrity, but sometimes it can be a positive thing because constraints and limitations sometimes give a focus to a work that otherwise would be just self-indulgence would just prevail and promiscuous. Self-congratulating kind of gestures of flamboyant ego would just prevail over the work and diminish its effect.
Raoul, unfortunately, we've run out of time. It was a joy as ever to talk to you. I wish we had more time to continue our conversation. For our audience, let me say again that this has been Spectrum, and our guest has been the artist Raoul Middleman. If any of our listeners would like a cassette copy of today's program, please send $4 to Educational and Public Affairs Director, the Media Center, Towson State University, Towson, Maryland, 21204. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Spectrum with co-moderators Dr. Pete Morani and Dr. Eric Belgrad. Join us again next week at this time for another edition of Spectrum, a weekly production of the Educational and Public Affairs Programming Department on 89.7 WCBT FM, Towson.